Frank Sinatra used to drive out here on weekend nights, back when this stretch of California desert had yacht clubs, a private airstrip, and more annual visitors than Yosemite National Park. Today, the water 20 feet from where his boat once docked smells faintly of rotten eggs. The shoreline is littered with sun-bleached fish bones, and a three-bedroom house down the block from where the Rat Pack used to party recently listed for less money than a used pickup truck. This is Bombay Beach, California, and it is only the first stop. Across this state, tucked into deserts, river deltas, and dried-up lake beds, there are entire towns where a livable property costs less than a semester of community college tuition. I have spent a lot of hours in county assessor records and old newspaper archives for this one, and the same pattern keeps showing up. These are not abandoned towns. People still live in every single one of them. What they do not have is steady jobs, reliable water, or, on a windy afternoon, breathable air. Before we get into it, if you are the kind of person who likes wandering into the corners of the map most people drive past, go ahead and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep digging up places like this. And while you are here, drop a comment and tell me what state or country you are watching from tonight. Now, back to Bombay Beach, because the story only gets stranger from here. Bombay Beach sits on the eastern shore of the Salton Sea, California's largest lake in Imperial County, about an hour and a half from Palm Springs. The lake itself was an accident. In 1905, floodwaters from the Colorado River broke through an irrigation canal and poured into a dry desert basin for nearly 2 years, filling a sink that had been dry for millennia. Nobody planned the Salton Sea. It simply happened, and California decided to make the best of it. By the 1950s, the state's Department of Fish and Game had stocked the new lake with salt-tolerant fish, and a property boom followed. Marinas, yacht clubs, and vacation homes sprang up along the shore. Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, and later the Beach Boys were regulars. For a stretch of years, the Salton Sea pulled in more tourists annually than Yosemite. Then, the lake turned on itself. With no natural outlet, every drop of agricultural runoff from the surrounding Imperial Valley farmland stayed in the water, and salinity climbed year after year. By the 1970s, fish were dying in numbers large enough to wash up in windrows along the beach. 2 hurricanes in 1976 and 1977 flooded low-lying resort communities. The smell of rotting fish and the sight of dead pelicans did what no marketing campaign could undo. Tourists stopped coming, and most of the businesses that depended on them closed within a decade. What remains today is a town of a few hundred residents, many of them older, some living on fixed incomes, alongside a newer wave of artists who have turned abandoned trailers into open-air sculpture installations. Home prices here have dropped into the tens of thousands of dollars, a fraction of what similar square footage costs almost anywhere else in Southern California. The catch is written into the landscape itself. As the Salton Sea keeps shrinking, it exposes more of its lake bed, a crust loaded with a century of pesticide and fertilizer residue washed down from the valley's farms. Desert winds lift that residue into the air as fine toxic dust, and Imperial County now records some of the worst asthma and respiratory illness rates in California. Add summer temperatures that routinely climb past 110 degrees, a long drive to the nearest full-service hospital, and a local economy that never really replaced tourism, and you start to understand why a house here can cost less than a used car, even in a state famous for unaffordable real estate. Trona sits on the edge of Searles Dry Lake, deep in the Mojave Desert of San Bernardino County, at the end of a lonely 2-lane highway more than 20 miles from Ridgecrest, the nearest town of any real size. It was built in 1913 as a company town by the American Trona Company, later known as Searles Valley Minerals. to pull borax, soda ash, and other minerals out of an ancient dry lake bed. For over a century, the company did not just employ the town, it essentially was the town, providing housing, running the local water utility, and funding the schools. That kind of arrangement works fine until the company itself is in trouble, and Trona has had a brutal few years. On July 4th and 5th, 2019, back-to-back earthquakes measuring magnitude 6.4 and 7.1 struck almost directly beneath Searles Valley, causing more than $5 billion in regional damage and knocking out power, water mains, and gas lines throughout town. The mineral plant alone absorbed roughly $50 million in repair costs. And according to the company's own later filings, its extraction operations still had not fully recovered years afterward. Then, in February of 2026, Searles Valley Minerals announced layoffs of about 300 workers, more than half its entire workforce, citing market, cost, and regulatory pressure. Local estimates suggested the town could lose close to 1,000 residents as families packed up in search of new jobs, and residents told reporters they were already putting their houses up for sale within days of the announcement. Home values in Trona swing wildly depending on the exact parcel, with recorded values ranging from as low as roughly $15,000 up to nearly $200,000. And a citywide median that has recently hovered between $50,000 and $80,000. The catch is that in a true company town, cheap housing and precarious infrastructure arrive together. When Searles Valley Minerals struggles, so does the water system it operates. Add earthquake damage that was still visible on buildings years later, a persistent sulfur smell drifting from the chemical plant, and summer heat that regularly tops 110 degrees. And it becomes clear why a house here can cost less than a used car even as the town fights to keep its lights on. Head north out of the desert, into the marshy islands of the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, and the story changes shape entirely, even if the ending sounds familiar. Islatan was founded in 1874. By a Mexican-American war veteran named Josiah Poole, who platted the town site on Andros Island and built a wharf for steamboats running between San Francisco and Sacramento. Chinese laborers, arriving through the late 1800s, built the levee system that turned the delta's rich peat soil into farmland. And by 1900, Japanese immigrants had joined them, working the asparagus and pear harvests that made Isleton genuinely prosperous. The town incorporated in 1923, and by 1930, its population had grown to around 2,090 people, supporting 5 canneries and 2 banks along a main street that still shows Chinese and Japanese architectural influence today. Isleton's decline came in stages rather than all at once. The Great Depression rerouted rail and highway traffic away from the river towns. Then, after Pearl Harbor, the entire Japanese-American population of Isleton was forcibly incarcerated under wartime removal orders, and most never returned to reclaim the homes and businesses they had built. Post-war agriculture shifted toward large, mechanized operations that needed far fewer hands, and the town's last cannery shut its doors in 1966. In 1972, a levee failure flooded more than half the city, forcing a months-long evacuation that many residents simply never came back from. Today, Isleton is home to fewer than 800 people, a number that has been slowly declining for years. Median household income sits around $53,000, and roughly 1 in 5 residents lives below the poverty line. The town's preserved storefronts, some listed on the National Register of Historic Places, sell for a fraction of what comparable Delta property costs closer to Sacramento. The catch here is baked into the geography. Isleton sits entirely within a federally designated 100-year flood zone, surrounded on all sides by aging levees that require constant, expensive maintenance just to keep the town dry. Flood insurance is not optional. Commutes to real job markets run long, and the same isolation that once made the Delta a haven for immigrant communities now makes it a hard place to build a modern career. In 1899, more than 3,500 people called a single gold camp in the Mojave Desert home. Today, the entire population of that camp would fit inside a single school bus with room to spare. Gold was discovered on the slope of Rand Mountain in Kern County in 1895, and the town of Randsburg grew almost overnight around it, complete with an opera house, a general store, and enough saloons to keep several thousand miners entertained after their shifts. A silver strike at the Kelly mine in 1919 extended the boom for another generation, and tungsten mining kept the district alive through both world wars. Nearby, the town of Johannesburg was laid out in 1896 as a planned service community, the only one in the district built with straight streets and right-angle intersections, meant to house the families and shopkeepers who supported the mining camps. Eventually, though, the gold ran out, the way it always does. The 2010 census counted just 69 residents left in Randsburg, and Johannesburg is smaller still. What makes this pair of towns unusual is that they never fully died. Locals call Randsburg a living ghost town, one with an operating general store that still has a soda fountain dating to 1904, a couple of bars, and a scattering of occupied miners' cabins, some of which have been restored and are now rented out to travelers curious about life on Old Route 395. Real estate here reflects the strange in-between status. Vacant parcels of high desert land in Johannesburg have sold for as little as $15,000 and $23,000, while actual structures, when they come up for sale at all, tend to run somewhere between $160,000 and $220,000. The catch is less about disaster and more about permanence. Summers push past 110 degrees. Winters can drop below freezing overnight. There is no full-time medical care in either town, and both places depend almost entirely on tourism from off-road riders and history buffs rather than any steady local industry. It is a fascinating place to visit. It has never been an easy place to build a life. If you have made it this far, you already know this channel is basically a slow tour through the parts of America that got left behind, one county record at a time. If that is your kind of thing, the subscribe button is right there and it costs nothing, unlike almost everything we are about to talk about next. Picture a grid of paved streets, working stop signs, and street lamps stretching to the horizon in every direction, with absolutely nothing built on either side of them. That is not a description of a town after a disaster. That is a description of California City today, exactly as it has looked for decades. California City was founded in 1958 by a sociologist and real estate developer named Nat Mendelsohn, who purchased roughly 80,000 acres of Mojave Desert with the goal of building a city that could rival Los Angeles. His master plan called for a central park, an artificial lake, a golf course, and enough platted lots to eventually house around 400,000 residents, organized around a downtown core with several satellite suburbs. The plan fell apart on a basic logistical problem. Mendelsohn needed a reliable water source to support a city that size, and after years and millions of dollars spent searching, the aquifer his engineers found sat on the opposite side of the property from where he had already designed his downtown. The city center had to pivot west, leaving the eastern half of Mendelsohn's carefully platted street grid essentially untouched, a permanent skeleton of a city that was never filled in. California City is, by land area, the third largest city in the entire state, covering 203 square miles. Its actual population, however, sits at only around 14 to 15,000 people, nearly all of them clustered on the developed western side, while the eastern grid remains open desert, crossed by street signs pointing toward intersections that do not exist yet. Inside that unbuilt grid, individual residential lots have sold for as little as $9,500 and $15,000, some available through owner financing for a few $100s down. The catch is that owning one of those lots and living on it are two very different things. Most parcels in the unbuilt grid have no water, sewer, or power connection, meaning a buyer has to drill a well, install a septic system, and run their own electrical service before the land is livable at all. Add unpaved access roads, a considerable drive to reliable health care, and a desert climate that swings from scorching summers to freezing winter nights, and the $15,000 price tag starts to make a lot more sense. The Salton Sea claims a second town in this story, and it is worth understanding because the mechanism behind its collapse is different from Bombay Beach, even though the two towns sit on the same shrinking lake. In the late 1950s, a developer named Penn Phillips subdivided tens of thousands of home lots around what became Salton City on the sea's western shore, marketing it aggressively as California's next Riviera. Buyers from across the country purchased lots sight unseen, drawn by advertisements promising marinas, a yacht club, and a resort lifestyle in the desert. Salton City's collapse followed the same script as its neighbor across the lake. Rising salinity, agricultural runoff, and the sea's long-term shrinkage killed the resort economy by the 1980s. And because so much of Phillips's original subdivision had only ever existed on paper, most of it was simply never built. Drive through the platted sections today and you will find paved cul-de-sacs with street signs and stop signs, waiting patiently for houses that were promised sometime around the Eisenhower administration and never arrived. What is left is a strange hybrid, a developed core with a median home listing around $310,000, surrounded by thousands of platted but empty lots that sell for a small fraction of that figure, some for under $10,000. The catch mirrors Bombay Beach almost exactly. Toxic playa dust, punishing heat, and streets platted 70 years ago that still have no water or sewer running to them. Not every collapse story in this video involves an accident of geography. Nyland sits at the northeastern edge of the Salton Sea, near where the paved road effectively gives up and the open desert takes over, not far from the Chocolate Mountains aerial gunnery range used by the military. It grew up in the early 1900s as an agricultural shipping point along the Southern Pacific Railroad, once sending carloads of cantaloupes and winter vegetables from the Imperial Valley's irrigated fields out across the country. Nyland never had one single dramatic death. Instead, decades of farm mechanization and the consolidation of small operations into larger agribusiness steadily reduced the need for local labor, and the town simply stopped growing. Its most famous neighbor, an unofficial community called Slab City, formed on the abandoned concrete slabs of a decommissioned World War II Marine Corps base, and has since become one of the most extreme examples in the country of people choosing to live entirely off the grid, with no government-provided water, power, or sewage service of any kind. Homes in Nyland proper have listed for around $110,000 in recent years, while the surrounding desert land goes for far less, and vacant 10-acre parcels near the old hot mineral spa outside town have sold for well under $100,000 total. The catch here is straightforward and severe. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees. There is no municipal water or sewer service outside the developed core of town. The nearest hospital is a long drive on a 2-lane highway, and living this close to an active military gunnery range means certain areas are permanently off limits. People who choose Nyland or its off-grid neighbor are usually choosing isolation on purpose, not stumbling into it by accident. And now, the town that might be the most quietly devastating story in this entire video. Keeler sits on the eastern shore of a lake that no longer exists, in the shadow of Mount Whitney, the tallest peak in the contiguous United States. It began in the 1870s as a shipping point for silver ore from the nearby Cerro Gordo mines, and by the early 1900s its population had swelled to somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people. The Carson and Colorado Railroad made Keeler its terminus in 1883, and in the 1920s the town briefly reinvented itself as a resort, building an Olympic-sized public swimming pool that drew Hollywood actors filming westerns in the nearby Alabama hills. Then, in 1913, the city of Los Angeles began diverting the Owens River into its new aqueduct, sending the water 200 miles south to fuel the growth of a distant metropolis. Owens Lake, which Keeler sat beside, had no chance against that kind of thirst. By 1926, the lake bed was completely dry. Mining activity wound down through the 1950s. Rail service ended in 1960. And as the exposed lake bed baked under the desert sun, ferocious Owens Valley wines began lifting its salt and mineral crust into the air. What followed were decades of choking dust storms laced with arsenic and other legacy mining chemicals. Storms, residents say, could strip paint off a parked car and turn midday into twilight. Owens Lake became, for a time, the single largest source of fine particulate dust pollution anywhere in the United States. Keeler's population, once in the thousands, now hovers around 60 or 70 people. A handful of old railroad boxcars converted decades ago into simple homes still stand along the town's quiet streets, one of the more unusual sights left in the Owens Valley. In the early 2000s, Los Angeles finally accepted responsibility for what its aqueduct had done, and the city now spends roughly $25 million every single year irrigating the dry lake bed just to hold the dust down. The catch, in Keeler's case, is really the whole story. Homes and land here are inexpensive, largely because an entire city, 180 miles away, permanently altered the local environment for its own benefit and left the people of Keeler to live with the consequences. Respiratory illness rates remain elevated. The nearest real hospital is well over an hour away in Bishop. And every windy afternoon is a reminder that this town's cheap real estate carries a price that never shows up on a listing sheet. So why do places like these keep emptying out, even in a state as wealthy and crowded as California? The pattern, once you have researched enough of these towns, stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like arithmetic. A single industry arrives, whether it is mining, a resort boom, or a canning operation, and an entire town organizes itself around that one source of income. When the mine plays out, the water rights get sold to a distant city, or the salinity finally kills the fish. There is nothing underneath to catch the fall. The people who stay are often the ones with the fewest options to leave, and the ones who arrive later are usually chasing cheap land rather than replacing what was lost. It is worth saying plainly that the people still living in these towns are not failures, and their poverty is not a punchline. Most of them inherited a set of circumstances that started collapsing before they were even born, and they have stayed anyway, out of loyalty, necessity, or a version of home that the rest of us are not really in a position to judge. Who could actually live in a place like this? Realistically, it takes someone who can work remotely or does not need to work at all. Someone in reasonably good health who is not relying on nearby specialists or emergency care. And someone genuinely comfortable with heat, isolation, and a level of self-sufficiency most of us have never had to practice. Retirees with a paid-off vehicle and a strong tolerance for solitude tend to do better here than young families. For everyone else, these towns remain fascinating to visit, worth understanding, and difficult to actually inhabit. I will leave you with this question because I am genuinely curious how the comments will split. If a real, livable home cost you $15,000 but came with no nearby hospital, brutal summer heat, and an economy that no longer exists, would you take the deal? Tell me honestly in the comments. There are dozens more towns like these scattered across this country, and I will be back soon with another one. This video is for informational and historical purposes only and is not financial or investment advice. Property values change, and viewers should do their own research or consult a professional before making any purchase decisions.